And I think for session 2, which is on decentralized finance applicability, supply chains management, our first presentation is from Jenny Lee. Jenny is at Northumbria University, and her presentation is entitled Roadmaps to Support Implementation of DLT Smart Contract Applications in Construction. So Jenny, it's a pleasure to have you here, and ready when you are.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to present. So as Abel mentioned, my name is Jennifer Lee, and I'm currently finalising my PhD at Northumbria University. Hopefully we'll be submitting in the early part of next year. And today I'm going to talk about the final part of my research, which was to develop some roadmaps. There's quite a lot to get through, so I'm going to go quite quickly and hopefully incorporate some audience participation through the form of a poll. So my plan is to talk through the methodology for developing the roadmaps, and then I'll briefly introduce the roadmaps and then go through some kind of multiple choice poll questions if you would so kindly oblige. So just as a bit of a precursor, so obviously Martin presented on the national roadmap before. The roadmaps that I'm presented today are kind of sitting below that. So these are the 20 different aspects that are recommended within the UK's national blockchain roadmap, and you'll see, hopefully you'll see kind of how the roadmaps that I've developed will kind of contribute to this. So whereas the national roadmap is obviously looking at the country as a whole, the roadmaps that I'm presenting are focused on the kind of sector level. So quickly, just to explain the methodology. So to come up with these roadmaps, I developed, I ran a couple of workshops, and the way I did that was to engage with 2 applications that are in development for construction. The first is the iContract, which is looking at automating the construction contract, and the Weather Ledger, which is automating weather compensation events. So I held initial consultations with the application owners just to understand a bit more about the state of the applications, what the objectives were, and then I looked at applying the scenario axis technique, which I'll talk through on the next slide. I conducted 2 workshops, one for each application, and then looked at pulling out all the different actions that came from the workshops to identify the need for a roadmap. And actually it came out that there was a need for 2 roadmaps, just because the actions couldn't necessarily be attributed to one kind of level. Then the next part is validation, which I'm looking at, so hopefully stay with your participation, but also with people that attended the workshops and additional industry participants that I'll be contacting in the next week or 2. And anything that comes from these validation steps, I will incorporate into roadmaps, so the final roadmap framework that will be published as part of my PhD. So the scenario axis technique is taking 2 aspects and considering how the future might look within these scenarios. And the purpose of using this kind of technique wasn't necessarily to envisage what the future would look like. It was more to take certain visions of the future and think about how these applications might fare depending on what the futures are. So the point is not really about what the futures are, it's how these applications can respond to those futures. And so these aspects were asked, and these details were sent to the workshop participants just to get them in the mindset of saying, okay, so if we had a government that was very focused on public and permissioned DLT, what would that do, and how does that kind of incorporate within the application, and what would happen if they were if the government was very passive or if it's very active and that kind of thing. So it's really more about the process of thinking about how these applications would fare, rather than trying to come up with how we think the future might look. So the things that we considered at the workshop are several different aspects around these applications, and all within the context of my social technical framework. That's kind of the basis of my PhD, of how we look at blockchain and distributed ledger technologies. And the idea was to kind of consider these different applications and think about the different prerequisites, internal, external factors that might have an impact on their development, what any potential risks, opportunities and limitations were, and then actions and challenges to come out of those. So the first of the two roadmaps that I'm presenting today is a macro level roadmap. This is the idea of this roadmap is to support the sector in reaching readiness to be able to implement distributed ledger technology and smart contract-based applications. There's 7 key actions within this roadmap, and these are actions that can run in parallel by different groups of people. The idea is that we have a national a task force appointed by a national authority that would drive this roadmap, and then each of these different aspects focus on a different element that would help create this kind of ecosystem that we need that would be ripe for these kind of applications. I would say that this is kind of a draft, so the feedback today hopefully will help move that forward into more of a final version, along with the other applications, the other validation activities that I'll be doing. So the first is to mobilize a task force. The second is to actually consider what we want as a sector, what are the needs of the ecosystem, how do we actually get to a point where we can deliver these applications. Benefits management plan, I think, is really key, just to be able to identify and realize benefits and push that out and use that as a basis to attract other organizations to use these different technologies. Of course, regulatory environments are key, and I think that was mentioned by Martin as well. Skilling of the workforce, bringing in new people, and how you actually create and deliver courses across the sector for that. And something that we're particularly bad at as a sector is research and development. So it's creating a plan for research and development and actually implementing that and building that into the kind of the ethos of the sector going forward. And then finally is looking at a sector engagement plan. So how do we engage with the sector to encourage them to use these kind of technologies and help them understand it and think about how they would integrate to their work day to day. So as an example, I've given you here one of the actions, which would consist of several different activities, and there would be actors that would be responsible for that. That's not to say that the primary actor would deliver that particular activity, but they may indicate or delegate to different kind of actors to run those activities. So for example, here, establish a benefits management plan is really about identification of the different benefits and ensuring that they can be realized, who will realize those benefits, and that they're democratized across the sector, that not one party kind of wins over others, and how do you look at minimizing the impacts to any potential negative impacts of potential actors. And some of the activities would take place quite early on, and others would kind of start within the first couple of years and go beyond that. And some would take place after that, and this is something that would follow on following the point of adoption, that would take you to hopefully an ecosystem that is using these different applications on a day-to-day basis. So this is where your participation comes in, hopefully. The things that I'm looking at based on what I've presented on the macro roadmap are clarity, accuracy, and usefulness. The participation is voluntary. The outputs would be used in my thesis and research publications. And so the way to join would be to follow this QR code, and it will take you, so either through your smartphone, or there is also a link on the next page. So if you just hover the camera over the smartphone, click the link, and that'll take you through to this poll. So how easy, based on what I've presented, and I appreciate that I haven't given you a lot of detail, but if you could indicate how easy you think it is to understand or not, as the case may be. And then I'll move on to the next few questions. And it is kind of an early version, and hopefully this will develop as we go. So I'll just give you a few moments for more people to respond. Okay, let's go to the next question. So the next question is, how representative do you think the roadmap, the macro roadmap, is to meet the needs of the sector that would support achieving digitalization through distributed ledger technology and integration? Integration, sorry. Okay, that's great. So the next question is on usefulness. So how useful is this to actually fulfill its intended purpose, which is to support the sector in reaching the state of readiness? And don't forget, this would kind of sit below the original, the UK level roadmap, and this is more specific to the construction sector, and this is at a sector level. I would just add that the responses here are completely anonymous, so I have no idea who is giving these responses, and I massively appreciate your support here. So the final question in this poll, before I move on to the meso roadmap, is what would make this roadmap more effective? So you could just add, if you could add a couple of comments, if you feel that's appropriate, just to make it a bit, anything that I could take on board to develop into the next version and the next iteration of the roadmap. Value chain specific examples and use cases, that's great. Run pilot projects. So some of these things come into the meso roadmap, and I'll explain on the final slide how they kind of link together. But these are great, and I think probably should be highlighted more in the macro roadmap. These are really great. So stakeholder roadmap with roles and responsibilities. So I have that to an extent. I appreciate, obviously, there's a lot of detail I've been able to give in terms of the time frame today, but that will kind of build into the next element. So I'm going to move on to the meso roadmap. I'm going to move quite quickly just because I'm very conscious of time. So thanks for your participation so far. So the meso roadmap is really about supporting development and implementation specifically of applications. So while the macro was was looking at the ecosystem as a whole, this one is looking specifically at development of applications. And this is a progressive roadmap. It's made up of 6 different stages. And the first is to consider the current system. The second is then thinking about what we want the new system to do. Where the new system is created is in stage 3, which is where you actually develop it and think about things like how regulations would affect the application skills, that kind of thing. Pilots then take place at stage 4, followed by the opportunity to make any changes before you've reached mainstream adoption. So as an example of one of these stages, stage 1 here just gives you the kind of the details of the sub-level actions that would take place at this level. So again, we've got a task force that would drive development of the application, and depend on who that would be. Depends on I think the size of the application that we're looking at, the potential impact that it would have on the sector. Thinking about what the current system does, what do we actually want it to do longer term, and what's the gap analysis from where we are now to where we want to be, and then actually an evaluation of the current technologies that are offered in terms of DLT and smart contracts to see whether they actually could deliver what we need as for the application, and actually accounting for the fact that potentially the technology might not be ready for what the application is needing at the moment, and there may be something else that's more appropriate. And I think that's something that's quite key and that comes out of quite a lot of research, is just because we have this technology doesn't mean we should use it. So here we have a number of tools that can support this. So I appreciate, obviously it's difficult for you to understand the bigger picture of these roadmaps without a lot of the detail, but what we would see is deliverables from these actions that would move forward into the next stages of the roadmap. So again, back to the poll for the macro, and I appreciate this is an early stage. It's difficult because I haven't given a huge amount of detail on the roadmap, but if you could kind of indicate, again, the same 3 questions we're looking at is clarity, usefulness, and accuracy. Okay. So same, how representative is it of the needs of the sector that would support implementation of distributed ledger technology and smart contract applications? Okay, great. The final poll before we move on to the open-ended question is usefulness. So how useful is this to fulfill its intended purpose? Is it, would it support these development of these applications? Okay, and again, so the final part of this poll is, as with the macro roadmap, what would make this more effective? And again, I appreciate, obviously I haven't given a huge amount of detail for each of the different stages, but any feedback here would be great to move to build into the next iteration. So simplify it, I think, is a great comment. I think I agree with you there. It really needs to be a lot simpler. Less text, more visual. Yeah, I think I'm going to look into how I can make it into more of an infographic. Enterprise business view. Okay, great. Okay, perfect. Thanks very much for your participation on that. So this is just a very quick highlight of some of the links between the two roadmaps that would show how they kind of would work together, or how different aspects of one would integrate into the other. So, mobilizing a task force at a macro level, you would expect there to be people within that task force that understand about the applications at a meso level, so people that were developing the applications, organizations representative of the sector. So to be able to create this ecosystem for the sector, you need to have people within the sector at the different levels in there. Scope of requirements, again, kind of having an awareness of what the sector is developing, to be able to understand their needs and supply that for them as a sector. Benefits management plan would actually come from, a lot of that would come from benefits that are seen at a meso level through pilot studies, case studies, etc. Regulatory environments would hopefully incorporate working groups and people, again, application developers, other organizations from across the industry that would deliver this for the sector, not just for specific applications. And upskilling of the sector, of the workforce, would actually be something for the national governments to address, but then on the meso level you could utilize that, but you would still obviously you potentially feed into that to identify what those needs are for the sector. And again, the same sort of thing with the research and development plan, is that you would have meso level participants actually delivering research and development and using potentially some of the funding that you would have in a research and development program to develop these applications into the sector. And then finally, the engagement plan, so driven by macro level engagement, but actually benefits those application developers organizations potentially looking at exploring DLT and smart contracts. Now, these are just some of the links. There are obviously more than that. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to close out now, and thank you very much for your participation. And I think a lot of the feedback and the comments will be really useful in the next iteration of the roadmap. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Jenny.